So we're here to talk about Spinoza after politics, but I think we should begin at Spinoza with politics, Spinoza in politics. That is to say, Spinoza's contribution to politics. And there's a good deal that's been written about Spinoza's far-sighted and elegant contributions to philosophy, including social and political philosophy. Spinoza, as the story has so often been told, was born into the Jewish community in Amsterdam at the center of the Dutch Golden Age, but was persecuted and ejected from that community because of his suspected atheism. Spinoza, that prince of philosophers, I'm not challenging that term, it's a lovely term. Spinoza, that prince of philosophers, it's a phrase that even Bertrand Russell and Gilles Deleuze both agree on. Spinoza, the prince of philosophers. Spinoza, who privately and meekly developed a brand new metaphysics which turned Cartesian dualism inside out. Spinoza, for whom God and nature were equivalent, for whom there was just one substance understood through various attributes like extension and ideas, and for whom all things in nature are singular modes or expressions of the all-encompassing power of the universe, from the smallest worm in the blood up to the face of the whole universe. He uses this remarkable phrase in one of his letters, facies totius universae, the face of the whole universe. So I'm just going to do that point, just one point again. Over the last few decades, Spinoza's mainly taught for the ethics, his main work on ontology, epistemology, and the good life. And in this usual framing, which I'm glad is starting to change a bit, he's usually not an end destination for study, but enough a station along a route of early modern philosophy, which begins with Descartes and ends with Kant. But in his time, and for some time after his death, Spinoza was best known, I think, for the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, which I'm just going to call the TTP. In English, it's the Theologico-Political Treatise. I just call it TTP, it's much easier that way. A work which scandalized contemporaries by debunking the authority of miracles a century before David Hume. And a work which set out a rigorous, uncompromising reading of biblical scripture and prophecy in strictly naturalistic and critical terms. So while some of Spinoza's arguments against superstition and on the risks of public fear for creating the conditions of mass tyranny were guided, I think, by the Stoics and Epicureanism, Lucretius, others carried a mark of his time. And this is where we get back to this initial point, Spinoza's contribution to politics. Okay, right, so what's Dan Taylor's contribution to this debate? So I'm going to offer two positions, which I'm going to defend within 10 minutes. So you might need some persuading on this. But I'm going to offer two positions, and then I'm going to use them to think through some of the challenges and opportunities of using Spinoza, of adventures in Spinoza. So for me, I think it's an original position, but you can come back on me if not. For me, Spinoza's most significant contribution to politics is relationality, which is to say, the foregrounding of politics in human relations. Hold on, there's more to this. Relationality is our life in common. It is the ways in which different individuals are shaped and constituted by their relations with others. These relations are often the primary source of our power and weakness, our joys and hopes, and our sadnesses and fears. They are relations of interdependence, not independence. These webs of relations, and George Eliot, a keen reader and translator of Spinoza, came to view society in terms of a web or thread of relations. These webs can be stitched together to become sources of public power and collective freedom through principles of mutual understanding and care. Okay, that bit's the kind of neo-Spinozan thing. I can't pin that entirely on Spinoza. And care is where I'm going to get to in a short outline. But these webs of relations can also become like a net, which traps, stifles, and crushes individuals, often marginalized individuals, or freedom-loving individuals in despotic societies. So relationality is double-edged. There's a good tradition of foregrounding politics in relationality. Aristotle's book Politics roots the political order, not in abstract ideas, but in two important principles for Spinoza as for the Stoics. The first is our fundamental human nature as sociable animals, and the second is our private and personal relations. So Aristotle talks about the relations between husband and wife, father and child, master and slave, that build a hierarchical web from private to public. The Stoic Heracles set out the idea of circles of concern that extend outward from the self to close family out to the community in the city. What's interesting about Spinoza's approach to relationality is that it's not foregrounded on what a later time would call the nuclear family. Spinoza does not use this term, or on unjust relations of inequality that are given the veneer of natural respectability, like master and slave. For Spinoza, individuals realize together their capacity to reason and act through association and fellowship. Again, that's a neo-Spinoza point. These individuals could be friends, lovers, strangers, siblings, parent and child, whatever. But for me, they're bound by two core principles for relationality, which I'll now go through. Hope this is okay so far. So the first principle is an understanding of human beings as modes of power, as expressions of power, that's Deleuze's phrase, in their relations with others. This is underpinned by what Spinoza called a conatus. Okay, I'm not being totally original here, I'm just kind of doing an unpacking. That all things in existence, not just human beings, because Spinoza is opposed to anthropocentrism, makes this clear in the appendix to part 1 of Ethics. All things in existence are defined by the fact that they strive to persist or persevere in their being. This is their conatus, their striving. It is not a striving in the sense that we would understand a conscious endeavor. A pebble strives to persist in being when it remains inert, complete, as the tide picks it up on the shoreline and drags it into the sea. But for human beings, we experience this conatus as desire. And I think one of the really interesting approaches to Spinoza's politics is the politics of desire that you get in Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. And it is through our striving through which we act or are acted upon, through which we think for ourselves or have the ideas and judgments of others passively imprinted upon us. In other words, this core characteristic of nature, of human nature, is the measure of our power. I should add too, that when we experience this conatus as desire, desire is like an appetite, striving to persist in being, plus a consciousness of it. And this consciousness is so interesting. What does it mean? It's like a layer of ideas, of emotions and judgments about what we judge is most conducive or habitual to our striving. Okay, principle 1, the kind of the human nature power conatus thing. Principle 2, core principle for relationality is the affects, which is a term Spinoza uses for emotions, though affect isn't equivalent to the modern sense of emotion, not totally. Nowadays, we think of emotions in terms of internal subjective feelings, but the emotions are mental and physical states and dispositions through which we are disposed to act a certain way, usually under the influence of a prior experience or reflection upon it. So we have two principles of relationality, there's human nature and the conatus, that's 1, and then the affects, number 2. And Spinoza, okay, this is where we land more directly into Spinoza. And Spinoza often refers to these as standards in his political thought. So in the Tractatus Politicus, not to be confused with the TTP, the TP is confusing, but in his final unfinished Tractatus Politicus, he refers in the first chapter to 2 authorities. The first is human nature as it is, not as we would like it to be, echoing Machiavelli. And the second is the approach to politics as a science of the affects, through which the affects are understood like weather patterns. In the Ethics, he uses similar phrasing. He talks about understanding the affects with the same rigor as if they were geometrical lines, planes, or bodies. In other words, to subject the affects to the same critical scrutiny to ascertain their causes. And like the Stoics, I mean, maybe we could talk more about that in the Q&A. The Stoic influence of Spinoza, I think, is important. Again, it's been picked up in the past. And like the Stoics, to use a model of nature, naturalism, as a standard by which to theorize about the good life. Hence, in the TTP, he refers politics back to nature, back to the naturalism that we get in Thomas Hobbes and the state of nature. But this is a naturalism in which individuals cooperate together out for mutual security and assistance, not merely to escape a war of all against all, exchanging one form of domination for another. This is something different. In the TTP, Spinoza also refers to 3 laws of nature. The first being the conatus, the second being that out of 2 choices, we will always choose the greater of 2 goods or the lesser of 2 evils, which in a way seems like a tautology, but let's not go there. And then the third one is that states, political states, nation states endure by working towards the common good. So now I'm going to get to the politics. And it's this last law that gets us to the role of the state for relationality. Spinoza was aware of a tradition going back, I guess, to Diogenes the Cynic, who knows how far we trace it back, of viewing the organized nation state, political state, as itself a kind of evil, a necessary evil, as the corruption or bastardization of human nature, as alienating human nature, as it was in some sense for Rousseau when he writes about civilization. But instead for Spinoza, it is through the state, the freedom of the state, that there becomes an organized structure for education, deliberation, and executive action through which our relations with one another are strengthened and bound by a common mind towards increasing our mutual capacity to think and act as equals. The Italian philosopher Riccardo Caporelli, another great author, has just recently published something on Edinburgh University Press's Spinoza Studies series. Riccardo Caporelli has an enlightening term for this. He calls the state a factory of powers, in that the good state, a democratic and free state, manages, harmonizes, and develops powers according to a naturalistic framework. But all this sounds rather idealistic and unworldly. Today, our relationship to the state is more strained. War, AI, climate change, mass manipulation. As societies become more internally complex and globally interconnected, as people become generally much more educated and live longer to an extent, so states are needed to provide more protection and support for citizens. I'd argue that this is a new form of mutual security, comparable to the foundation of the civil state as Spinoza and Hobbes understood it. But it also raises challenging questions about our obligations to each other as relations through one another. So when we think about these problems of relationality and the possibilities of a politics of care, we're talking about a politics which is defined by connections, obligations, and mutual aid. Kind of trans-individuality, as Etienne Balibar says, perhaps, but also one that's alert to the many things, the forces that stifle and repress freedom. That a web can also be a net. Now, these are brutal necessities as social care changes, as people across the world lose their homes and travel in search of shelter for a place of hospitality. And they ask difficult questions of our relationship to the state. But Spinoza wouldn't accept that a deflated realism or fatalism about the coercion of state structures is the right conclusion. If freedom is through the democratic state, then that freedom also holds the promise of what Alexander Maffron, one of the best readers of Spinoza, and Gil Morejon is translated a great collection of essays by Maffron quite recently, what Maffron calls a communism of minds. Something that's interdependent, pluralistic, harmonized, but not homogenous. I might have talked for over 10 minutes there, so I'm going to stop my bit there. Yeah, thanks for being patient listeners.
Gil, can I pass over? Can we pass it over to you, and then afterwards I'll have a few points that I'd like to discuss.
Wonderful, sure. Thank you, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for Anthony, Dan, and Solange for putting this together and having me. So I'll just jump right in. Everybody wants their own Spinoza. In the 18th century, he was a pantheist. In the 19th, an atheist. In the 20th century, a materialist. Sometimes this was said in the mode of claiming him as a fellow traveler or as a predecessor. Sometimes, by contrast, this was done in the mode of denouncing him as heretical, dangerous, or obviously wrong. It cannot be without interest that Spinoza's thought is somehow capable of receiving such conflicting and even contradictory interpretations, of inspiring as well as repelling such a wide variety of positions in the modern space of theoretical and practical reasons. In Spinoza's case, though, it must be said that sometimes the kind of work required to make his thought commensurate with the political and philosophical sensibilities of the day goes somewhat beyond hermeneutic charity to the point of demonstrable distortion. Personally, I find compelling Yitzhak Melamed's argument that we should be rather skeptical about the contemporary practice of producing charitable interpretations of historical philosophers. Perhaps instead of finding creative ways to explain away their obvious divergence from our own beliefs and intuitions, it would be better to let them retain that distance from us, which alone would make it possible for their thought to challenge those things we tend to take for granted today. So today I'd like to explore one such recent appropriation of Spinoza and object that it doesn't really work. I have in mind the radical tradition in contemporary political philosophy, starting sometime in the 20th century, that could be described as anarchist or antinomian. I'll define these terms in a moment. The roots of these tendencies go back much farther than that, of course, but I'd like to focus on the more recent trajectory. Time constraints won't allow me to give sufficient evidence for the existence and the degree of influence of this trajectory, so I'll simply describe it by unpacking these two names that I've given, and hopefully you'll recognize what it is that I'm talking about. Anarchism is a politics characterized by its opposition to the state, or more generally, its opposition to concentrations of and organizations that hold political power, whose imposition of certain norms of behavior is understood as being repressive and also as arbitrary, or sometimes being in the veiled interest of a particular class of people. Closely related to this is antinomianism, opposition to the law, or more generally, opposition to normativity as such, again, as being repressive or even oppressive. The closest I'll come here to evidencing my claim is this. Pick up any number of books in the continental tradition by Foucault, Deleuze, Negri, Agamben, or their followers. In the Anglophone tradition by libertarians like Nozick or his, and you're likely to find a generalized skepticism of or outright hostility to the state, to the law, or to the very notion of normativity or its enforcement. For different reasons, similar kinds of hostility exist as well in the Marxist tradition, which tends to view the state as an instrument or tool of the ruling class, and to view the dominant norms of civil society as the ideological means of reproducing the antagonistic class relation requisite for continued capital accumulation. This is what I have in mind when I talk about there being at least a significant undercurrent in contemporary political philosophy that sees normativity in the state and the law as fundamentally repressive, antithetical to human freedom, things that need to be opposed or perhaps escaped from. My claim today is that Spinoza's thinking cannot be easily assimilated to these anarchist, antinomian, or Marxian modes of political thought, if it can be assimilated by them at all. But a good number of these thinkers have claimed Spinoza's for themselves as a kind of predecessor or precursor. I hold with Dan, in fact, that Spinoza attempts a science of politics, which for him means determining the governmental forms and practices best suited to establish the conditions for maximal stability for any given mode of social organization. But this, of course, presupposes that something like the government or the state is necessary. This is exactly why he cannot be an anarchist or antinomian political thinker. Spinoza thinks that the immanent dynamics of human sociality are such that something like a state or government with the ability to effectively enforce certain norms of behavior is unavoidable, indeed necessary, and even desirable when properly understood, as soon as a certain number of human beings live together in a community. If I wanted to be polemical, and I kind of do because it's fun, I'd say that Spinoza thinks a state spontaneously starts to form as soon as 3 people live together. I'll argue this in 3 steps. First, human beings are, for Spinoza, fundamentally limited in their understanding. Most of our knowledge of things, including each other, is inadequate, partial, and confused. It's true, he thinks, that the best thing in the world for us is to live with other beings, but we mostly fail to understand one another. This leads me to the second point. Because of the general inadequacy of our knowledge, we generally rely not on what we understand, but what we imagine to be the case about one another. And this means, again, as Dan pointed out, that it's our affects that tend to most significantly shape our desires and how we act in respect of one another. Human beings are subject to passions like hope, fear, and envy, and we're spontaneously imitative, emulating the affects of those around us. It is not because we rationally understand that society would benefit us, but rather out of our common fear and our common hope that we strive to live together. And this leads me to the third point. In short order, our common hopes and fears come to bear on the same object, Alexander Maturin makes this argument. That is the power of all of us together. It is this collective power that we quickly come to realize is the most powerful thing with which we are familiar. This is the power of the multitude. And Spinoza holds that sovereignty just is right determined by the power of a multitude. When one of the members of a society acts in ways that are imagined by the multitude to be contrary to its perseverance in being, the multitude will do everything in its power to prevent that action and to destroy that member if necessary. And this will be by definition right, even if the threat posed by that member is only imaginary. For again, our knowledge is generally inadequate, and that does not in any way undermine the basis of sovereignty. In this way, without any rational reflection on the potential benefits of social life, rather than living in the state of nature, as in Hobbes, without any recourse to a social contract, just out of the immanent dynamics of human affect, we see the emergence of sovereignty, the formation of a state, and the establishment of norms of living in common, backed up with threats and violence. I'm only going to read one quote today, and it's this, and I'm going to put it up on the screen because it's nice to read along. And it's the part for the second scholium to Proposition 37 of Part 4 of the Ethics. He writes, society can be maintained, provided it appropriates to itself the right everyone has of avenging himself and of judging concerning good and evil. In this way, society has the power to prescribe a common rule of life, to make laws, and to maintain them. Not, of course, by reason, which cannot restrain the affects, but by threats. This society, maintained by laws, and the power it has of preserving itself is called a state, and those who are defended by its law, citizens. Now, I do not claim, or do not mean to suggest that all states are equally good, or that all norms or the mode in which they're enforced are worth preserving. Certainly, it's easy to come up with examples of both that we can all agree are bad. But I do think that Spinoza is right that this much is necessary, that the maintenance of a social group is possible only in and through the establishment of some minimal set of norms for a common rule of life, some minimal set of laws, which will be enforced through threats of violence and at the limit by the actual exercise of power. Perhaps this is indeed repressive, as the anarchists and the antinomians say. But Spinoza thinks that this minimal repression is unavoidable. In fact, within the boundaries established by this minimal repression, the conditions for the possibility of human freedom are, for Spinoza, not negated but fully preserved, as it is this same power of the multitude that can best maintain us in our existence and enable the development of our capacities for understanding. Lastly, on this point, Spinoza is a realist about our nature as finite thinking beings. He takes us for what we are in our determination through affects, and this makes possible a genuine science of politics and freedom. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gil and Dan, for these introductions to Spinoza and politics. First of all, I wanted to announce that we'll go a bit over the hour to also have some questions towards the end for the audience. So please, if you have any questions, do put them in the Q&A rather than in the chat, and then afterwards I'll read them to Dan and Gil. So listening to your presentations, what I was particularly interested in is how it relates to contemporary politics. And this especially came to the fore in Gil's presentation, but also towards the end of Dan's introduction, I think. Because as you mentioned, Gil, Spinoza's politics has been particularly appropriated by an anarchist or sort of an anti-authoritarian left, right? So whereas there seems to be an argument for the necessity of the state. And Dan, you also mentioned Alexandre Matteron towards the end and this communism of minds, and you seem to be arguing that in Spinoza's philosophy, there would be this potential for communism or politics of care centered on collectivity and maybe solidarity, and that it's fundamentally a thought about, or politics of, relationality and independence. So on the other hand, it being the day that Berlusconi died, I wanted to kind of explore also the counter argument. Well, because there seems to be this tautological aspect to Spinoza's thought, in particular to this third rule that you mentioned, Dan, in the TTP, which is states endure by working towards the common good. So there is kind of this, there seems to be this idea of everything kind of working out towards maybe the power, the power of this collective, or kind of an increase of the power of the multitude, right? However, with the rise of the alt-right in mind, or maybe police violence today, it is not counterintuitive to think, well, this kind of necessity of the state that Spinoza is talking about might inevitably lead to more repression, and not this kind of communism of minds that Matteron is talking about. So I was wondering how do you explain this, and maybe also in relation to the Conatus, which might be understood in kind of a Hobbesian way. So why is it not that, or reading it in and of itself as the endeavor of each being to persevere in their being? It sounds almost like a very competitive notion of human nature, or even individualistic. So how does this, how is this not the case? Or why do you think this is actually not the case in Spinoza, that it's not Hobbesian? I mean, you both mentioned it quite quickly, but yeah, I was wondering if you could expand on this Hobbesian reading, and why it doesn't hold, and also related maybe to kind of the obvious observations today of extreme police violence and the restriction of legal rights that actually go against, you know, this the power to persevere for minority groups.
Fantastic. Should I go first? Yeah, and then you go second, or do you want to?
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you so much. Those are really interesting thoughts, and I'm going to try and do justice to some and probably make a hash of others. I also just wanted to say, I found Gil's presentation so fascinating, and I'm going to pick up one bit here, which is Spinoza's this figure who has different seasons, who's reborn for different political purposes. I think it's a great line. And I guess we're thinking about the context of Spinoza's politics, its reception, and its influence in radical political thought like Antonio Negri or Deleuze and Guattari. I guess we're using this as a starting point. I think this is really interesting. I don't know if there's anyone in the audience who came to Spinoza through Negri. I did. And I've had to kind of, I don't know, like not decontaminate myself, but I love that Spinozism. I think it's been a fantastic channel into Spinoza, but it's raising difficult questions because actually, Solange, let's use the point about police violence. One of the revolutionary approach to Spinoza's politics in Negri, in Deleuze and Guattari, in Laudon, is one that mobilizes Spinoza to resist domination, and as it's kind of understood in a contemporary way, you know, through the domination of individuals in terms of what Macpherson called possessive individualism, the domination of individuals in terms of the sad affects, which means that we kind of perpetuate the sources of tyranny as they would see. So there's something useful happening here, that actually Spinoza's radical politics can mobilize bodies and minds against domination, but then the whole problem is the anti-statist politics, which Gil brought out very, very nicely. That actually, in some sense, if freedom is going to be through the state, and it's going to be the sovereignty of the multitude, their popular sovereignty, that can't be an anti-statist or an anarchistic retreat, because then you see the institutions through which which public power lies, and that's a difficult challenge. And that, I mean, that in a sense reflects the context in which Negri enough has come up. It's the counterculture, it's the new left, it's the resistance to these old institutions, but it's really difficult. I'm going to use one of the points from Gil brought up, and then I'll hand over to Gil. Gil, when you talked about the affects of the multitude, and you had that great quote from the Ethics about the desire for revenge, it made me think of a line from the Tractatus Politicus about what defines the political order. It's these common affects of hope, fear, and a desire for revenge. And it's a really interesting line, because what you, I think, paradoxically get in a Tractatus Politicus is Spinoza also setting out what he considers the best form of politics, or the highest form of politics. And you have this tension between human beings as they are, the realism, which is very much there, the revenge, you know, which constitutes society. And he's probably thinking of what happened in the Netherlands in 1672. But then you have this kind of ideal, and this is where I'm going to want to ask you what you think about this, Gil, because I'm still puzzling over it, even though I've read it millions of times. It's the line that comes up in the Tractatus Politicus, the power of the multitude as led by one mind, una voluti. And what that means in terms of your presentation, is popular sovereignty there? Is that leading towards a kind of a collective thinking together, or is it just, even Maffron uses this phrase, a regulative ideal in a Kantian sense? It's an impossibility, thinking by one mind, that as many as possible, thinking as much as possible, which Balabar says it's not really, it's not realism. It's an exemplar. So I'll stop there.
That's very interesting. Yeah, the una voluti mente, as the collective body is led as if by one mind, on one translation. I don't know. I think that Mathurin actually has an article about this in the collection I translated, and he makes the case that obviously it's not a mind in the way that you and I have minds, or we all here have individual minds. But on the other hand, it is something like the coordinated set of ideas that are sort of isomorphic with this set of bodies that makes up this collective. And that's, in another sense, sort of what we do mean by a mind. I think that there's a tendency towards like democratic popular sovereignty in Spinoza, in his way of thinking about what sovereignty is most fundamentally. Like you said, he's interested in like laying out the optimal forms in the political treatise of first monarchy, then aristocracy, then democracy. And optimal here means best capable of persevering, of continuing to exist. And that means figuring out how to sort of dissolve tensions, how to like quell antagonisms, how to sort of prevent the sort of conflicts that arise more or less spontaneously on the basis of, I think, the finitude of our understanding. As for the but he thinks that democracy is best or most approximative of this ideal of what actually sovereignty is, which is just this collective power operating as right. As for the communism of minds and the tension between that and the sort of need for a state and repression, which I'm sort of harping on here, I take Spinoza to be, I think that, you know, Mathurin is good on this. I think you can try to have your cake and eat it too. He's certainly not one of these anarchists or antinomians that I've been sort of banging on about. But I think Spinoza teaches us that even in communism, there will still be conflict, right? And, you know, the conflict might take different forms. It won't be class antagonism or capital accumulation with exploitation. But even in the communist society, we're still going to be finite understanders who imagine each other differently and wrongly, and will think that our desires conflict when perhaps they don't. I take it that in response to something you asked, Solange, like, is there a competitive picture of human nature here? I don't think so. I think that Spinoza wants us to recognize that competing with and against each other is an effect of the inadequacy of our understanding. That if we understood more adequately, we would see that the sort of solidaristic ethos of care that Dan's pointing to is in fact better for us, right? That, and then to connect that back to the sorts of examples that you were giving as well, Solange, like the sort of alt-right rise, these like, you know, closed, narrow-minded nationalisms, racist xenophobia, and so forth. These are all very inadequate, extremely inadequate forms of understanding, very bad ideas, actually disempowering ones, for which we're all worse off. And, you know, what it looks like to combat that might not be pleasant, but it's not because they're right about anything.
Thank you so much. Dan and Gil for these thoughts, and I just wanted to come back to what you say last, Gil. So if I understand correctly, then it just all comes down to the inadequacy of our ideas, and how could we? Does it stop there? Can we just say, oh well, these kinds of politics or the emergence of these kind of politics today is just due to the inadequacy of our ideas? And what does that exactly mean in relation maybe to this kind of broader ontology?
Yeah, I think that one way, for instance, of understanding this, if I think about like I mentioned, racist nationalism in the United States today, this comes from a position of disempowerment, in fact, or at least of perceived disempowerment. White supremacy is a politics of aggrievement. This is a group of people who believe themselves not to have the kind of power that they believe they deserve. Whether or not that's true, in fact, is sort of beside the point, right? That they imagine it to be so determines them to act in these ways. However, for a lot of these people, they are in fact quite disempowered due to things that have nothing to do with racial difference, right? So there's a kind of, again, false, inadequate, partial understanding. I think that a starting point might be figuring out how to recognize the real forms of disempowerment by which people are led to go on to imagine the wrong enemy, right? I do think that there are centers of collected power in the society in which we exist today that are antithetical to human flourishing and freedom. And it's not like people of color or trans people, obviously, right? So figuring out how to develop ways of communicating, and it's a politics of pedagogy in a sense, I would say, right? Like this is one of the possible upshots of Spinoza's realism about affect in politics, is figuring out how to mobilize people's affective determination where they are, so as to lead them to develop more adequate understandings of their own circumstance. I don't think that's a very exciting thing, and it doesn't promise all that much. But like he said about affect in the beginning of the preface to part 3 of the Ethics, right? It makes no sense to bewail thunderstorms either, right?
Can I just come in on that? Have we got? Yeah, I promise I'll be quick. Moira Gatens, who's a fantastic reader of Spinoza, has this wonderful phrase. She talks about the education of the imagination. And I think you can almost apply it to the affects. There can be an education that comes with the affects. And one of the really exciting traditions that you get in Materon, and you get it in others too, I guess, working in French Marxist Spinozism, which I think is a very fertile vein to be working in, is the pedagogy or the education that comes with the affect of indignation or anger. And indignation is this kind of force that can dissolve repressive political orders. Now, we're immediately falling into the trap that Gil's highlighted, which is that if we are against something, this can easily be mobilized by the far right, it can be mobilized by fanatics. And Spinoza is very much alert to this when he talks about revolution and sedition. He's against sedition and revolution because in his time, the revolutionaries were the Calvinists, who wanted to kind of push down the liberal order. But I think just in terms of us thinking here as a group of people, I think indignation is one of the really curious approaches. And there might be a link there when we think about Black Lives Matter and the understandings of anger in Black radical thought. This is something that I've been working on in an unlikely way, but I've been working on a bit in the last couple of years. I published a paper, it came out last week, in Contemporary Political Theory, comparing Malcolm X and Spinoza on the education that can come through indignation, which, maybe I'll try and put a link in the chat and you think, what the hell? This is how it can go wrong, folks. Yep, that's it.
That sounds like a fascinating paper, Dan. Thank you. Thank you so much for this discussion. And I think maybe we should move on to the questions in the Q&A. And we have some more time, about 20 minutes for questions now. So one of the questions that I have in the Q&A comes from Alice Tamini, and they're asking if it's possible to extract a coherent politics from the ethics alone, or whether the TTP is necessary for such an account.
You want to take it, or I can go?
Okay, I'll do this one, but you go first. The next one, okay?
Sure. Okay. Great.
All right, so, I mean, Alice, what a great question. There are different ways of doing Spinoza, and I think the common way is just to draw out a politics, using the ethics, using the ideas of sociality and democracy, some of which Gil highlighted. You get the ideas of, especially part 4 of the ethics. Nothing is more useful to a human being than another human being, and this kind of thing. And you can do a lot of good work, and a lot of people do. But at least where I come, my way of using Spinoza is to really work with stuff like the TTP and the TP, because there I think you get much more depth in terms of the critique of domination and superstition, and you get more on democracy. But I mean, the ethics is, you can spend decades on the ethics. So if that's all you get through, I think you'd still get a really rich politics out of it. Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think that the conceptual resources required to develop a political account are there in the ethics. Especially, like you said, parts 3 and 4. But he wrote books on politics that kind of do the work of that extraction for us, and so and does treat these things in greater detail.
I have a next question from an anonymous attendee, who is asking, how is Spinoza's theology, sorry if I mispronounce this, Deus sive natura, connected to his politics? And does accepting Spinoza's politics, whether in the form of care or a more status variety, imply accepting a cosmic divinity as conceived by him? And why or why not?
Starting this time, his conception of God is so idiosyncratic that it's very possible, as I mentioned, to argue either that he is a theist, or that he is a pantheist, that is, that all is God, or that he is an atheist, that is, he's using the word, but it's God in name only, and he's really describing nature as a whole, or what in his technical terminology is the absolutely infinite substance, this thing, this universe of which we are all parts. I think you do need to buy into some version of this. Whether or not you're happy calling it God or not is a sort of matter of personal preference, I think, more than anything else. But the notion that, in fact, we are all parts of the same world, parts of the same universe, that are able to affect each other in these sorts of ways, that we're not atomistic, freestanding, independent beings, as sort of liberal individualism would have it. I think that some buy-in there is implied in, or a prerequisite for Spinoza's way of thinking about politics. I don't know if you, yeah.
Yeah, I think this is an absolutely brilliant question. It's difficult because it might sound strange to say, but I see myself as a Spinozist, very much a disciple, but I really struggle with part 1 of the ethics, which is completely the wrong way of doing things, because really we know the ethics is produced in geometrical order. You've got to start from the beginning, and you need to be persuaded by the demonstrations in order to get to the bits that I really like, which is really from the middle of part 2 onwards. But I mean, I think for me, I've often struggled with Spinoza's ontology, but you wouldn't be able to explain the things that I've drawn out, like power and the affects, without being able to explain power as understood in terms of human beings as modes of one all-encompassing power, which is not a Spinoza term, one immanent power, of which we are just modes, expressions, or parts. So you need that, I think, to get to the ontology of power, the dynamism of Spinoza. I think sometimes it can be difficult, especially when we're working our way through those first 8 propositions of the ethics in part 1. And we're kind of confronted with a thinker who isn't a modern. He's kind of between medieval and modern, we might say. And those are difficult passages, but we have to, for better or worse, walk with him on that journey that it takes us on. Thank you.
I think the next question ties in with the idea of modes, and Julia is asking whether you both see a coherence of parts, the coherence of parts in politics, and how does the coherence of parts interact or inform the idea of the conative?
I mean, I could make it. I could start with a foray, and Gil can tidy up. How about that? But Gil, you go first after. Yeah, I mean, so Julie, if I understand you right, I'm thinking here about part 2 of the ethics, proposition, I think 13, where Spinoza presents this physical digression, or little physics, it's sometimes called, where he considers not just a singular individual or conatus, but a multiplicity of forces that maybe work together and produce a common effect. And I think one of the really rich ways of reading Spinoza's politics is going back to the conatus or conatuses of individuals in an organized society, and the ways in which those individuals kind of cohere and mobilize and achieve common effects, or increase their capacity to think and to understand. And there is a metaphysics there is a dynamic metaphysics there of these conatuses kind of working in a kind of direction, and it raises this really interesting, very peculiar debate within Spinoza studies. I think Gil's got a position on this. I think I've read Gil on this, of whether the state, the nation state, the organized state, can be understood as a kind of collective individual, which involves all of these different conatuses acting towards one common purpose. And that itself is intriguing. Can there be collective individuals in the way that I think you're suggesting, that a coherence of parts becomes a kind of a collective individual? And it's one that I've often struggled with. You can think about collectives in Spinoza in terms of an orchestra of many different parts producing a common effect. Or I think it's like pebbles on a beach. Or maybe there really are collective individuals in Spinoza. So if that's where you're going, Julie, I think that's a really interesting starting point. And I'm going to hand over to Gil.
Yeah, no, the physical digression between props 13 and 14 in part 2, the definition he gives of an individual is anything that maintains a certain ratio or proportion of communication of motion and rest among its parts. There's a characteristic ratio or proportion of motion. And Materon writes this article as, is the state in Spinoza's sense an individual in Spinoza's sense? And the answer he gives is yes. The orchestra is a great example too. It's just that, you know, what you shouldn't imagine is that the more complicated a body or a collective is, the greater its degree of like stable individuality necessarily. The state has a very low, or the civil society has a very sort of low degree of necessary maintenance, right? It can accommodate quite a large range of variation. An increasingly complex body can actually have an increasingly complex threshold of disindividuation, it seems to me, for Spinoza's metaphysic. So that, you know, this is also why we're, as individual human beings, capable of increasing and decreasing in our power so much. We're capable of affecting and being affected in so many ways, much more so than a much simpler body with a simpler ratio being communicated amongst its parts. So yeah, I like Dan. I think that a society does have a certain kind of individuality. It is a certain sort of individual. This again, we come back to this odd question of, does it have a mind? Then I think Materon says that the answer is yes, and that the mind is the law, the actual laws of the society, which is fascinating. Broadly enough construed to include like implicit norms as well. Yeah.
There is a fascinating, I think the next question is a really great question by Etienne, who is mentioning both of your books, in fact, and is saying that in both of your books, there seems to be a critique of certain conceptions of individual freedom or voluntarism. And Etienne would be interested to know what kinds of autonomy or individual freedom can be warranted in the political realm after Spinoza.
You're right. I'm going first this time. You next, Dan. Yeah, I'm completely convinced by Spinoza in his critique of free will in parts like 3 of the Ethics and elsewhere, that you know, we are always in fact determined to act in certain ways by our modes of affection. I just actually have a hard time, if I can confess this, remembering what it was like to believe in this sort of everyday sense of free will that most people have, where you just spontaneously decide in a voluntaristic way to make one choice rather than another on the basis of nothing really at all, right? This is basically what this conception of voluntaristic freedom asks us to accept. But Spinoza is a rationalist, and I'm a certain sort of rationalist too, and I think for no reason isn't a good reason to give for things. So then the question is, right, what kind of autonomy or freedom can still remain? And Spinoza's got like a very sort of straightforward definition for this, which is that freedom is acting according to one's own nature, as opposed to acting, and it, this could be understood as a sort of close to Kant, right? And sort of instead of being heteronomously determined or determined to act from without in ways that don't accord with my nature, right? Producing those effects that follow from the sort of being that I am in my determination is what it means to be free. I'm not ever going to be absolutely free, only relatively so. And I can become more so, Spinoza thinks, the more I understand others and the more I understand myself, and the relationality, to use Dan's term here, that we constitute together, and which is the sort of fabric out of which we're spun, right? So I think there is a really exciting kind of freedom to explore there. It doesn't look very much like the assumptions we make about freedom in most sort of liberal political theory, I would say.
Dan, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say a great deal because you put that so beautifully. I'm just going to say one thing to Etienne. It's a very perceptive point. And I think for me personally, in my direction to Spinoza, I guess it's reminiscent of when Althusser talked about going for a detour through Spinoza in order to reach a kind of a certain political end. I think for me, I found Spinoza nourishing and useful in the ways in which it gives us resources to critique aspects of liberal political theory. I don't want to critique it too much because there's a great deal that's worth defending, especially when we think about far-right populism and so on. But just in what seems to me a slightly more deflated sense of the worth of the individual's autonomy. I guess the backdrop really here is the decline of socialism and social democracy. So I guess my Spinoza, my neo-Spinozism, draws out the collective, the communal, the relational, because I'm trying to find resources for a position which defends other forms of flourishing, which aren't just the individual's own aspirations and achievements. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you. I think we should move on maybe to the last question, and it's a critical one. So Alice asks, Spinoza is often read as rejecting final causes or teleology, thus arriving at a politics based on power and affect described by you. But doesn't such an approach deprive politics of a direction or an organizing principle? In fact, one might argue that the current political confusion and free-for-all is precisely what Spinoza's politics engenders. It does so by eliminating final causes, call them substantive meanings, if you will, that organize the use of power and affect for the sake of ends. So no ends doesn't lead to confusion.
Shall I go first? I mean, it's a brilliant and difficult point, Alex. I'm not going to do justice to what you've raised, but I'll try and defend how I've come to this. I suppose if we're thinking about does our politics fall into this kind of dangerous war of all against all, or kind of post-truth situation because we lack a core organizing principle? Well, I think Spinoza does provide an organizing principle, but it's one that's rooted in an understanding of human nature and human flourishing as it is, rather than, say, an exemplar or end destination by which we compare politics and society. I suppose what I'm saying here isn't totally convincing, because if Spinoza were just rigorously naturalistic, we would, according to him, as he says himself, we would accept human beings as they are. And that means we accept the ugliness, the violence, the superstition, the fear, and so on. But what you have in Spinoza, I think, is this really interesting tension. It's the tension between the realism and the optimal. It's the tension that you get, I suppose, and I'll try and give a bit of an example here. In the Ethics, you have part 3 and part 4. Part 3 is the account of the affects, the emotions as they are. And part 4 suddenly turns that understanding and turns it towards using this knowledge to increase human understanding, to increase our capacity to act, to increase our capacity for joys that are lasting and durable. And I think then you might be thinking here, and Jonathan Bennett's made this point, hold on, this is a sort of teleology, isn't it, really? Because really Spinoza's got a teleology of what the good life involves. I think if he were here, he would say, wait a second, it's rooted in this understanding of human nature as it plays out in the here and now. But I think this is a very perceptive point, Alex, and I think you're getting to something that one of Spinoza's best critics, Jonathan Bennett, raises in his book, which I think is a fantastic book.
Yeah, I have to agree. It's a really good question. I also don't know if I'm going to have a super satisfying answer. One way, though, of interpreting Spinoza, I'm not entirely sure that I buy this, but this is at least one way of trying to respond to the worry here, is that, he's making a claim like there are no real final causes in nature, but certainly because of the kinds of finite beings that we are, because of our lack of total understanding, we're not God, we're just a little piece of things. We are beholden, as I mentioned, to imagination, and we certainly imagine ends, and the ends that we imagine do direct our action. In that context, then I don't see why we wouldn't use our imaginative capacities, and in hopefully combination with the capacity we have for understanding, to be intentional and directed in our politics. There are things that I want to see which do not now exist, and I think this isn't metaphysically ruled out by Spinoza's insistence that, like, in nature, right, plants don't evolve for the sake of something or what have you.
I think I would like to follow up on Alex's question by asking, would there be a way for Spinoza to predetermine what type of organization or political organization would increase our power to act? And maybe this ties into your politics of care, Dan, in fact.
Yeah, I think that, that's a great question. As I mentioned, I think that there's an important element of pedagogy here. I can also plug the other book that I've just recently translated is by François Zouabichvili, and it's called Spinoza's Paradoxical Conservatism. And I think one of the most exciting parts of that book is the second part, which is on the concept of childhood and on the notion of growing up. And in it, he talks about what a Spinozist pedagogy would look like. It has to do with figuring out the conditions under which a relatively powerless being, right, which is the state in which we find ourselves upon birth, not at all capable of enduring on its own, completely reliant on others, can exit that state progressively, gradually, right? Sort of become capable of a certain degree of relative autonomy, still relative, right? Still interdependent, still embedded within that relationality that Dan likes to talk about, but less so completely dominated by external causes. And this means both developing the capacities of the body and the capacities of the mind. So what sorts of forms of social organization are conducive not just to giving people, what it is that they need, but providing them with the resources to develop their capacities for flourishing on their own? I think that asking that question starts to point us in the direction of some concrete answers. This is a sort of formal response, but yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll just add on that. So I've not read this Zouabichvili, and I will now that it's translated. My French is not good enough to make sense of it directly. But the analogy of childhood, the parent and the child, comes up in the TTP in chapter 16, and Spinoza talks about this is the role of democracy. So democracy as an organized form is the thing that it's a state form which is paternalistic. It's literally paternalistic when Spinoza talks about it. It's like a parent who looks after and nourishes and cultivates a child who is weakened in body and mind, but fosters that understanding. And I think this is so, I'm going to plug another book which I've really loved and I've got a lot out of, which is Moen Zaleka's Spinoza and the Freedom of Philosophizing. And he focuses on citizenship as a form of education in Spinoza using the TTP. It's a great book. And he makes the point that when we think about the role of democracy, it isn't just majority vote. That isn't really where Spinoza's going with it. Spinoza says that democracy is best because it most conforms to our natural state, because it's where all the deliberating citizens are equals. But what makes democracy important is it contains this certain capacity with deliberation. Spinoza talks about collegiality, collegial deliberation. And it's through the deliberation of citizens that a wider range of viewpoints are heard, that more representative and rational decisions are made. And I think when we think about the state forms that can really realize a politics of care or anything else, it would be democracy. And I guess Spinoza's understanding of democracy isn't quite our understanding of democracy. And we could, we notice when we read the Tractatus Politicus, and the kind of very limited account of democracy that you get there. But democracy isn't just a way of measuring votes. It's the cultivation of one and all's understandings, and it's through this that we have a more robust citizenship. And maybe that touches on the problem, Solange, that you mentioned a bit earlier on, you know, when we think about the rise of the far right.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I just wanted to add that, you know, one of the claims that Abdishvili makes in the childhood chapters is that, you know, looking around, even in Spinoza's time, and I think also in today's, if childhood is a good metaphor for becoming citizen, becoming fully actualized or realized as a human being, we have to say that we live in an infantile time with childish politics. I would not at all shy away from characterizing right-wing politics as a you know, childish one, born out of an impotence and confusion, and not conducive towards solving the problems of impotence that it is responding to.